Salut tout le monde! Welcome back to Unintentionally Frenchified. If you haven't seen any of my videos before, I'm Kate. I'm an American living in France and I've been here for the last 10 years. I'm currently living in Paris, but I have not always been living in Paris. I spent the first 3 years of my life in France living in Poitiers, in Pau, and in Bordeaux. And then I moved up to Paris and I've been in Paris for about 7 years now. Though I have bounced around a lot in Paris in different neighborhoods. I've lived in the 3rd, I've lived in the 19th, I lived in the 18th, I've lived in the 16th, I've lived in the 9th. I have bounced around desperately trying to find affordable housing, and spoiler alert, there is no affordable housing in Paris. So I've had a bit of experience living both within Paris and outside of Paris, also referred to as La Provence. And let me tell you, if you want to piss off a French person, the thing that you should do is just say, I've lived in Paris, I've traveled around Paris, and so therefore I know everything there is to know about France and everything there is to know about the French culture. And you're probably gonna have someone say to you, no, 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 Paris n'est pas la France. And to be fair to the Frenchies who are saying that, it's true. There are a lot of differences between Paris and the rest of France. And I was surprised when I moved to Paris after already living in France for 10 years, some of the different culture shocks that I experienced within the same country. So today's video is going to talk about the most important ones that shocked me when I first arrived to Paris. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, or you don't follow me on Instagram, then you know what to do. Hit the button. Otherwise, c'est parti. First things first, before I dive into the culture shocks, you have to know that Paris is actually 2% in size of the entire territory of France. However, 20% of the French population lives in Paris and 30% of their GDP comes from Paris, meaning that you really have a huge comparison between Paris and the rest of France. It's not like Spain, for example, where you might have a very big comparison between Barcelona and Madrid. Or maybe if I take the US for example, you'd have comparisons between Washington, DC and New York and Chicago and Los Angeles and Seattle and Austin. There's lots of big cities you can be comparing. In France, you have a country that is very centralized. You have the majority of what's happening in culture, in wealth, in companies happening in Paris. Not to mention that what else makes Paris and France unique is that Paris is both the economic capital and the political capital of the country. If you think about the other G7 countries, for example, in Europe, only 50% of them are like that. More often than not, you've got the same way that you can think about the US, where you've got Washington, DC, which is a political capital, and then you've got New York, which is the economic capital. So it's just in France, there's a lot of focus on Paris, which means there's a lot of comparisons on Paris versus the rest of France, even though Paris isn't the only big city in France. So in my case, there were some culture shocks living outside of Paris and then moving to Paris. I remember when I first moved to Paris, I was shocked, and I mean shocked, by the level of English in Paris. And you might be surprised what I'm gonna say, because I wasn't just shocked by the low level of English, but actually by how much English was spoken in Paris. Because France has this reputation for not being very strong in English. When I say that, we're comparing with other European countries surrounding France. So we're talking about how well the Germans speak English versus the French, or how well the Nordic countries speak English versus the French. They're not seen as being very strong in English. I had lived and worked outside of Paris for 3 years, and I had also taught English in schools for a year. And I would tend to agree that, there wasn't a high level of English. So to be very fair, I come from the US, there is no judgment, we are not great in a second language, but just objectively, no, it wasn't something like super strong, and I was used to really having to get by with my French. And then, I arrived to Paris, and suddenly everybody speaks English. When I was struggling to find a word or struggling to speak French, somebody popped in and spoke English, whether it was the person I was talking to or whether it was somebody next to me. When people would hear me speak French with a really strong English accent, they respond back in English saying, no, but I want to work on my English, so this is great. And I'm like, wait a minute, I want to work on my French. This is definitely not the case outside of Paris. I highly, highly recommend, if you want to spend a significant amount of time outside of Paris in France, that you brush up or you learn for the first time, so at least some basic, if not some beginner, intermediate French to get by. Lingoda, for example, is a company that I would really recommend for this. They connect students from all across the world with native speaking teachers in online immersion classes that are really cool. Obviously, because they're online, you can be super flexible about hours. They're 24/7. You can really find a way to fit it into your schedule. And you also are able to design a course for your specific needs. You get to really pick what classes you want to take and what topics they're going to cover during the class. There are classes about listening comprehension, about writing, about speaking, which is clearly the hardest. Even classes about culture. So if you haven't gotten enough of French culture thanks to my videos, then you can also get your fix on culture with Lingoda as well. They have over 1,400 native teachers working at Lingoda. So you can learn English, you can learn Spanish, you can learn German, you can learn French. And if you're thinking, hey, I will be spending some significant amount of time in the south of France and I want to brush up on that southern French accent, you'll probably be able to find the right teacher for you. So I've been working with Lingoda for over a year now, and my favorite part about Lingoda is the fact that the class sizes are very small, so you can have a maximum of 5 people, but you tend to have more like 3. I've had only maximum of 4, and this forces you to speak all the time. The teachers are really, really good about calling on you and making sure that they call out everybody who's in the class multiple different times, forcing you to speak. It's really good practice because speaking is the last thing that comes, and it's the hardest thing that comes when learning a language. And it's also something where you need another person in order to speak back and forth. And if you're crazy shy and you prefer really not to be speaking in front of other people, they also have private classes that you can look into too. So to wrap it up, Lingoda has a monthly subscription that's really flexible if you want to do that. Or they also have a marathon subscription where you can commit to a certain amount of classes up front and then possibly earn cash back too. So that is very motivating. Plus, with my code in the description below, you can get a 7-day trial for free and get 30% off your course fees. What's not to lose? Okay, so back to Parisian culture shocks. So the next thing I was very shocked about, which is quite linked to the amount of English that everyone speaks in Paris, is the amount of tourists. Yes, I know that Paris has tourists. It's a big city, like lots of other big cities that welcome tourism, but Paris oozes tourists. They creep out from the walls. They're everywhere. Try shopping at Galeries Lafayette on a Sunday in high tourist season. You can barely walk through that mall. Or walking down the Marais neighborhood in high tourist season, the summer during Fashion Week. It's a double whammy because you've got the models and you've got the tourists. You can't move. Or even Versailles at literally any moment in the day. The amount of selfie sticks going on, the amount of people trying to see things, it is nuts. The actual country of France was the most visited country in 2018. I tried to take a number pre-COVID, with over almost 90 million tourists during the year. And a huge majority of them made a stop in Paris. And as I told you earlier, the size of Paris is not that big. It's only 2% of the territory of France, and already 20% of the population lives within this 2% radius. So now you're gonna drop the 90 million tourists in there as well. And Paris gets crowded. On good days, you get this really pulsing vibe of energy of people discovering Paris, and it's exciting and it's beautiful. And on other days, you feel very French with your attitude, and you sit back at your cafe with your espresso and you glare at everyone taking up space on the street, wishing they would go back from where they came from, forgetting that you yourself were not born a Parisian. Tourists, you gotta love them, but man, is there a lot of them. Perfect transition as well to number 3, which was the attitude that really surprised me about non-Parisians versus Parisians. The thing is I had already heard that Paris tended to be a city where most people moved when they were younger to go to higher education, go to college, ended up staying because there was a great amount of work there and they got hired for jobs. And then eventually, as they started to build a family, and Paris is very expensive and not that affordable, they would move out of Paris. So Paris, to me, I always had this impression before coming that it was more of like a city of passage, you know, like where you kind of came in for a bit and then you left. And so while people living in Paris would have a certain attachment, of course, to, you know, where they were at, that they would also be, you know, quite neutral or even positive about people living outside of Paris because most of them came from outside of Paris. Lol, this is not the case. Well, COVID changed people's perception a bit about Paris and not wanting to live in such small spaces. For the most part, when people move to Paris and become Parisian, if you can become Parisian without being born in Paris, they tend to be very proud about the fact that they live in Paris. And all of a sudden, you feel like they've kind of forgot that they grew up in La Provence, outside of Paris, and that, you know, the attitude that people have about non-Parisians or non-people living outside of Paris used to be them. It's kind of like there's something in the water where when people arrive, they forget that there was a time that they weren't already here. And it's too bad because then you get very much this like city versus country reputation where the rest of France looks at Parisians and they think, oh, they're so snobby and overcultured, and you know, the Parisians will look at them and say, oh, the rest of France is so unrefined. And it's like, didn't all of you guys, you know, most of you living here in Paris come from those unrefined places? Like, what's the big deal? So I was kind of surprised by how competitive and, you know, just the attitude and yeah, the competition between Paris and everywhere else. The difference in wealth for me was a big shocker too. And I didn't grow up in a big city. So I know that some people will probably say for this comment, that's a lot of big city versus smaller cities. But in this really small space that is Paris, you are surrounded by the most wealthiest, richest French people. So all of the luxury, all of the cars, all of the fashion. I mean, even when you think of like the monuments and some of the, you know, not everywhere in Paris, but some of the streets, and you know, it's just oozing a lot of luxury in certain parts of Paris. You can't really get away from it. And then at the same time, you have the opposite side where you also have really the poorest people in France as well in Paris, because Paris is also where they have the most opportunity to find work. So they tend to stay here, but at the same time, this is where rent is really high. So you've got multiple generations of families living in very small areas. Yeah, there's just really this big imbalance of very rich and very poor, and you can turn from this beautiful street you're walking in to another street and see 3 homeless people laying on the ground, living right there. And I just wasn't really expecting there to be such an inequality that was so visible. And I'm trying to think of some, like, I remember being really surprised when I visited San Francisco a couple years ago and really seeing this same type of inequality, very, very poor areas of San Francisco. And I haven't necessarily seen that in other big cities. I'll be curious really on this point to see what other people say, especially those of you who have grown up in a big city and also know Paris, if you feel that way too. But yeah, I was really, really surprised by the inequality. And the final thing that I'm gonna talk about that surprised me were the shop hours. When I lived out of Paris, I started to get used to, if you can, after being American and coming from the US, the fact that shops were not open 24/7, that the lunch hour was a time for most shops, banks, boutiques to close, and also that often places that were open on Saturdays would be closed on Monday mornings. I had really gotten used to the fact that this was the case. On Sunday, in some of the places I lived, the only thing open to eat was the McDonald's and a couple of cafes. It's the way that France does things, and coming from the US, which is very used to this 24/7, everything's open all the time, even on Sundays you can do all the same errands culture, I had already kind of gotten through this shock when I moved. And then I arrived in Paris, and all of a sudden, things were open during the lunch hour. Like the kitchen in the cafe right there doesn't close from 3 to 7. You can actually eat something outside of normal eating hours. Or yes, that boulangerie might be open on a Saturday, but it's also open again on the Monday. And it was kind of, you know, a reverse shock trying to get used to the fact that things were open during lunch hours. At the same time, this is France, so my post office, for example, is never open when it says it's open. You go there, there's often a little piece of paper saying that they're exceptionally closed. I mean, there's still a lot of differences when it comes to hours between US and France, but I can see a huge difference in Paris when it comes to doing my groceries, for example. Things now on Sundays in Paris are open all day to do your groceries. Before, if I was lucky, if the grocery store was open until noon on a Sunday, but sometimes depending on what city I was in, this wasn't even possible. But now in Paris, from say noon to still 7 p.m., the shops are open. Usually it's only like the automatic checkout, so you can't say buy wine or you can't buy certain things, but you can go run and grab milk now until 7 p.m. on a Sunday. That is a luxury for me. That never used to be the case. All right, guys, so these were the first 5 things that surprised me when I moved from outside of Paris to Paris. I didn't finally focus on the personality differences or the stereotypes about that, so I'll be curious to see if you guys bring any of that up in the comments. Let me know what you thought. Do not forget to check out Lingoda. I put everything in the description below. I've got that code so that you get that 7-day trial free and also get 30% off if you sign up for more classes. And I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I will see everybody la semaine prochaine. Bisous!